Hi everyone, and once again, I apologize for the graining video, but as you can see, I have a hair color now, and later today it's probably going to be darker. So, feeling a little old with the gray hair. I feel better now. I'm happy to be able to talk to you today about paper two, because some of you have already started on it. Others of you are clearly still procrastinating that. And I also wanted to remind you that your test is due at the end of the day, Friday or Saturday, whatever I said on the schedule there at 11:59. So that's coming up, not too quickly, but it's coming up quickly enough that I want you to pay attention to it and know that it's happening, and to make sure that you have the opportunity to take that exam. Again, you have all the time you want. However, you only have one shot at it. So set aside, I guess a couple hours to be safe, and take that test and do what you need to do. Again, this is just me to check that you're reading and that you're watching the videos so that I know that you're getting the main concepts and ideas. And if you're able to go find those main concepts and ideas in your book, then that's pretty much all I need you to be able to do. Memorizing is not really important in the study of rhetoric. What's important is understanding the process. Just like we talk about communication studies, and I get so upset when people put an S at the end of that, because communications studies implies sort of working with the media or different ways of working with a medium to get a message across to multiple people. For example, when we're talking about whether it's better to do marketing online or better to do radio or better to do, television or billboards, that's studying communications, the multiple different ways that we can communicate and the pluses and minuses of that and the benefits and the cost to it. So I mean, that's a totally viable and important course of study. That's one that I did in my undergrad, but it's not what we're doing here, because of course we talk about communication with no S, meaning the process of communicating, which is a completely different story. And I try to explain this to people all the time, but if it makes you feel any better, my mom still says, I don't know what my daughter does. So hopefully you'll understand that by the time we get through the end of this course, that it is studying the process. And that's really what I need you to understand. And in studying processes, it's important we understand the components of the process and sort of the linear progression of that process, or the progression of that process in a nonlinear way. And it's also important to understand the development of that over time. So that's why the course is set up that way, specifically for that. And so your first paper is really just you telling me and demonstrating, or doing what we call explicating, what you know about a very specific and small piece of rhetorical theory from the ancient times or from the classical periods. Okay, so that's really what that paper was supposed to achieve. And for the most part, the ones I've graded have been perfectly fine in meeting that goal. So that's good. But the second paper requires so much more of you because it's an active paper. I'm asking you to do multiple things that are considered to be the practice of rhetoric. The first is picking out something, an artifact that is important. That's really interesting. I mean, that's hard to do. It's not, well, I shouldn't say it's hard to do. It's fun for most of us. But my husband will tell you, don't take me to a movie theater, because I would literally sit there and talk about all of the different aspects of the movie and what I thought about it, not during the movie, of course, that would be terrible. Although during the movie Inside Out, which is, of course, a kid's movie, my friend and I took our kids. And so there we were with three kids, and she and I sat next to each other, and the whole entire time sat there going, oh my God, that's totally blah, blah, blah. You don't always want to do that. And when we're at home, I was literally analyzing the Star Wars series because I grew up, of course, the first movie, as I call it, the first movie, for Star Wars, the original, came out 3 years after I was born. So I was raised with Star Wars. And when the new movies came out, 1, 2, and 3, I was devastated. They were terrible for so many reasons in my mind. And then 7, 8, and 9 definitely helped, I guess. But if I had my druthers, I would just have 4, 5, and 6 and be done. I just think they're the best movies. But my husband's like, "Why are you talking about this in front of our 10-year-old?" And I'm like, "Well, I mean, first of all, it's not like I'm talking about anything, that is necessarily inappropriate for a 10-year-old. It's totally fine. It's just that she doesn't care. She doesn't care why the transition from 4, 5, and 6 back to 1, 2, and 3 is problematic for me. You probably don't understand that. The reason being that for me, the Force was always this spiritual, cultural experience that certain people were tapped into, like sort of like a talent or a faith that other people didn't have or weren't as good at being in tune with it. And they had to train. So it was a talent or a spirit or something inside them, but then they also had to train or practice it in order to become good at it. And by movie 1, when you go back to that, which for me was the 4th movie I saw, all of a sudden it's about how many midichlorians you have in your body, these little tiny nanotechnology, I guess, things in your blood cells. That's stupid. But first of all, it took us from sort of a religious or spiritual aspect to a scientific one, which to me just made zero sense. If I'm going to tap into the Force, I'm not going to be like looking at my vein and trying to get it out of there. I'm going to be, sort of having this experience like Luke Skywalker. So they bring that back around with J.J. Abrams in the 7th, 8th, and 9th movie, but it's never the same. And one of the reasons why I notice it's not the same is because I watched it 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, right? I did sort of a Tarantino move when I just decided to, I didn't decide to. I watched it in a different chronology than you're supposed to. And for those of you who've seen Pulp Fiction, you know what I mean by that. And so what I did was I watched it in the wrong order. So now my husband says, let's sit down and watch it in order with Leah, who's almost 11. And we checked it out, and I went to Common Sense Media, and I'm making sure it's appropriate for her. I'm checking with her mom, because I'm her bonus mom, stepmom, and making sure that it's okay. And we sit down and watch these movies, and I realize all of a sudden that she's going to experience this very differently than I do. And very differently than I did, and that's okay. But I didn't think enough about it, because there we were, the 3 of us in the living room watching, and we get to Star Wars 3, and she sees Anakin, the incredible Hayden Christensen, get knighted or deemed to be Darth Vader, Lord Vader, by Palpatine, and she lost it. She turned around. She's like, "What? No, this isn't okay. Kill him. He's evil. Why is he doing this? I loved him. I love Danny." And I'm like, whoa, I was not prepared for that. It was sort of the reaction a lot of people had the first time that we heard, Darth Vader say, "No, I am your father." That really blew our minds. But here she was experiencing it in a very different way. Why do I tell you that story? Well, because that's the process of looking at something from a rhetorical perspective. You're looking for what message it's sending, whether or not it does that properly or well, and whether or not it's successful in sending that message. Now, if I were to argue to you that Star Wars 4, 5, and 6 are better than 1, 2, and 3, that would be one argument. Another argument would be that 4, 5, and 6 are spiritual, or spiritual, I think is the right word, where 1, 2, and 3 are scientific, and there may be a reason for that that's based in sort of our cultural experience together. So if we look at communication as the process of sharing and creating meaning together, if we look at it that way from a social construction point of view, which most of us do, at least the faculty does, then what does that mean when we listen to music or hear a television ad or a political speech or anything, watch the Star Wars series, and we watch it in different contexts? The answer is different things start to happen. So if I'm going to answer the question, which ones are better, that's a different question than what are they doing. And rhetorical theorists, or rhetorical critics, I should say, we go around answering these questions all of the time. Paper 2 is a formalizing of that process. So anytime that you look at something and your friends are like, oh my God, this song is so awesome, and you're like, it's Bieber. And they're like, but here are the 12 reasons why it's a good song. And they're not just saying it's because I like it. They're saying, various things. That I can't think of a Justin Bieber song that I actually like. So I'm going to have to roll back on that one, right? There are a couple things about me that I just block. I cannot like any Taylor Swift song. Sorry, guys. I can't like any Twilight movie. I have tried. I've watched them repeatedly. I can't get into it. But if you take a song like Tim McGraw's Red Ragtop, or you take the song Brick, or The Freshman, I can argue for you why all those songs, which probably were made before you were born, why all of them are about a pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy, and how that works. And I could lay out the argument for you. And I don't particularly care for all three of those songs, but I can make a really good argument for why they get their message across successfully very easily. Now, if you forced me to listen to a Taylor Swift song, well, there would have to be a screaming goat in the middle of it in order to get my attention. Let's just put it that way. So it's hard for me to listen to a 13-year-old's diary being sung in some sort of like fantastical rhythmic song and somehow be okay with that. I also don't have an appreciation for her voice. So Bieber at least has a voice. Then again, Harry Styles, you give me Harry Styles, I'm all about it. I know that's a little bit weird, but the dude has a crush on a 72-year-old woman, so I figure 46 is all right. I appreciate his music quite a bit, actually, much more than his aesthetic appearance. He is the song that he wrote. What's the name of it? It's relatively old, actually. I guess it's about 3 years old. I'll think of it. Sign of the Times. There we go. That song fascinates me. I have to listen to it over and over again because I question it. Like, what's it doing? What is it about? So rhetorical theorists or rhetorical critics pick things that are important to them and that they want to make important to others. So what you're doing when you do rhetorical criticism is the first thing is you are arguing rhetorically for something that is important or should be considered important. Okay? That's the first step, right? And the second step is explaining that artifact. If I were to take those 3 songs I talked about that were about unwanted pregnancies, I would have to explain their different time periods, their different messages, the language that they use, the metaphors that they use. I would have to really understand those 3 artifacts. If I were to look at why Bella sets back feminism 50,000 years when she's in New Moon, is that the second one? Whatever the second one is, the second movie in the what was supposed to be a trilogy, that is a completely different question. But I would need to understand feminism as a whole, and then I would be really needing to understand the movie and Bella's actions in the movie. So we're looking at context as well as the artifact. Okay, we're not just looking at the artifact, we're looking at context. That is very important to a rhetorical critic because it impacts the way that the message is sent. Then what we do is we usually find a formalized way of examining that text. That's called the method, okay? Or methodology, as one of my professors from Mizzou would yell at me for saying method. A methodology. How am I going to break this down for you and help you understand? If I'm looking at the 3 songs I talked about, Red Ragtop, Brick, The Freshman, if I'm looking at those 3 things, I'm interested in the content and the argument that they're each making. So I really want to sort of look at not necessarily the persuasion of it, but what its content is, what they are, how they compare. I might do a metaphoric analysis. A brick, a freshman, and a red rag top are all three metaphors for the idea of an unwanted baby. Okay. So that would be an interesting way. So I might do a metaphoric analysis. Now you're thinking to yourself, but you didn't give us metaphoric analysis to work with. You're right. I didn't. I can. If it's something that you're really big into, if you have a question that really calls for it, I can help you out with that. But if I tried to give you a lecture on every methodology known, we'd be here for a lot longer than 15 minutes. So yeah, gone. All right, so you might also do just a simple neo-Aristotelian analysis and looking at the content and what the genre is of that music and why they say what they say. You might look at whether or not they're persuasive or not, or if they're sending a message at all. Okay, so you might just use a neo-Aristotelian criticism, meaning the 5 canons, including the 3 artificial proofs and the 3 levels of style. You might be looking at that. If you wanted to look at Bella and why she sets feminism back, and here's the thing, I'm not really that big of a hardcore feminist type. I know, I have the haircut and the masculine tendencies, but I actually am not that big into it. But if I were going to do that criticism, I would totally have to understand her place in the overall waves of feminism that we see. And we're sort of in a new one, it appears. So that's another thing that is important to understand context for. Last but not least, if I were going to do look at a book that that's making an argument for, I don't know, if I wanted to look at Bolton's book about President Trump, where in the room where it happens, I would have to look at whether or not Bolton makes a satisfactory argument for his claims, whatever that is. I might be using the Toulmin model of argument, which some of you may not have read about yet, and that's okay. If I were to look at something and just want to make an argument for no reason, I don't know, my opinion, I wanted to give you my opinion, which a rhetorical criticism is always your opinion, but you're doing it in a formalized way that helps persuade your audience of your interpretation. So you're not just doing a rhetorical criticism because you're using a rhetorical methodology, because you're looking at a rhetorical artifact. You're doing it because you're actually trying to persuade. It's an act of rhetoric in of itself. Persuade us to understand that your interpretation of something makes sense. So it has to be formalized. That means there's 5 parts to every rhetorical criticism, which I've outlined in your paper assignments. You have to introduce the subject, which means that you have to find a way to introduce your rhetorical question. And I say rhetorical question here, not in the same way that you're used to. I should say you sort of introduce your research question, if you want to look at it that way. Does Bella set feminism back 50 years? How does Bella set feminism back 50 years? Which, of course, the second question relies on the first. What metaphors are used in these 3 songs in order to talk about the same subject matter? Are they successful in doing that? You might want to know how Edward and why am I still talking about Twilight? Because I hate it so much, I guess. But you guys are probably way past Twilight. I feel like there should be another cultural phenomenon that I can identify with, but there's really not. I'm old and I'm outdated and I've really got not much. But if you wanted to look at Edward and I don't know, Taylor Lautner's character, whose name I can't, Jacob, there we go. If you wanted to look at that, at what is done to them throughout the course of the movie, you might take what's known as a power critique to look at the balance of power. So instead of doing sort of a feminist criticism, which you could still do, but if you wanted to look at power and how that power is created and what the balance is and who's in charge, Bella, and why that's good or bad, then that would be what's known as a postmodern critique. And that gets into incredibly complex and difficult issues. So what I did for you, I think, is provided you with the what I consider the 4 easiest ways of looking at an artifact. The Neo-Aristotelian, the Toulmin model of argument, if you're looking at an argument, the dramatistic perspective by Burke, particularly the pentad, because that really gets into sort of plot, character, scene, etc. And then I believe feminism was the 4th one. So I don't know if that's exactly correct, but the reason I limit it is not because you have to be limited. If you are researching, you might find a rhetorical criticism of something and they use a different methodology that you really like. That's okay. Talk to me about it. Most of your sources are going to be in the methodology section. So the introduction of the rhetorical question or the research question. What is this artifact doing, or how is it doing something, or is it successful in doing what it wants to do, or what is the goal, etc. All of those questions. There's a lot of them. People, like I said, hate to sit in movies with me because I'll be like, wow, that really is impacting me and I'm not sure why. So I need to explore it a little bit. So the second part then is talking about the artifact itself. I've gone over this a little bit, talking about the context of it, what's going on in the world at the time of this particular event. Brick, the Freshman, and Red Rag Talk came out about the same time, really, if you think about it in terms historically. So the same musical time, I should say. So why? What was going on that was the conversation? Whereas if you look at the 2 songs by, you're not going to know who this is, but Dion from the 1960s, you're going to look at 2 songs called Run Around Sue, which you've probably heard, and The Wanderer, which you may or may not have heard. Both songs by Dion at the same time, in the same era, same year, I believe. Both made it really high on the chart. One is all about how Run Around Sue is just kind of, I don't know, today we might say a little slutty. She goes around and she's dating more than one man. How dare she? But for him, he's called the Wanderer. He goes out and he has multiple dates in one day. So it's okay for a man to do that, but not for a woman. And what does that create? And why is it occurring? And in the 1960s, there were a lot of reasons for that to be occurring, and it was considered acceptable. Would that be acceptable today? Probably not. Why? Because people have started to study these things and critically think about the messages that they're receiving. And that's what rhetorical criticism is. It's forcing us to do an in-depth look, really. And then for those of us who, are egotistical enough, we want to argue that in the public. Here's why my view is better or correct. But you have to have a good reason, which brings you to the methodology, the formal way of presenting your argument for why or how your interpretation is better. The 4th part is really easy. Do not make this hard on yourself. The 4th part, which is called application in a lot of ways, is just merely plugging the text or the artifact, the text from the artifact, into your method. So if you're studying the 6 parts of an argument because you're looking at a book or you're looking at something that makes an argument, you want to pull it apart and then put it back together to understand it, all you would do is say, here's what the claim is, here's what the evidence is or the data, here's what the warrant is, and so on. That's it. Plug and play. You're done. Because in the 5th step, you're doing the discussion. And in the discussion, you are going to explain what all of that means. So after I've told you what the parts of the argument are, and some may be missing or some may have multiple parts, I'm going to say, here's why that argument was successful or unsuccessful, or here's how it should have been done differently. So in the rhetorical criticism that you're doing for paper 2, you have 5 parts. which is why this paper is a minimum of 5 pages. I mean, think about it. There's 5 parts. You know that the methodology may take 2 pages. You know that the discussion is going to take a good bit of your time. Most of your time is going to be spent in the application and the analysis or discussion section. That's where most of your, or possibly in the description of the artifact. Most of your time is going to be spent there because that's your argument. So where do you get outside sources and what do you use them for? Well, when you're trying to find context for an artifact, a lot of times you need outside sources for that. I need to, if I'm exploring the 60s, I wasn't alive then. Shocker, I know. But I need to know what was going on then that impacted it, or in the 90s, which I just don't remember because I was in college and I had a really good time. I made that sounds so bad, but I did. I had a great time and I don't remember a whole lot of the 90s, not because I was drunk or high or anything, but just because I was having a good time and I didn't really pay attention to a whole lot, to be honest with you, which isn't good. But I never watched Friends. Let's just put it that way. That gives you an indicator of what I was doing. I was not sitting around watching Friends. I was out having fun. I was a debater. I was focused on those kinds of things. So I would have to research that a little bit. Plus, my memory of it isn't necessarily accurate, right? Or right now, if I was looking at a news piece, which there's so much to do, right? I mean, I watch Seth Meyers more than I watch anything else right now. Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, who's, by the way, terrible, but Stephen Colbert. I watch all 4 of those because I don't know why, but I'm fascinated that I'm getting my news from a comedy station or from a comedy show. So those are the kinds of questions that are always burning in my head, but I need to understand the context of them. The movie Inside Out is a very different message to young children than it is to us as adults. So if I'm watching this from an adult perspective, I need to make sure that I explain that. I mean, not that it's not obvious, but you need to explain how that might impact the interpretation. Would a child interpret it differently? Absolutely. So recognizing our limitations and our sort of opportunities in being who we are, where we are, in the time period and the culture that we are, in order to understand better what messages we are receiving. And that's that. So 5 parts to it. It's 5 to 10 pages. It's APA style, but it should be fun. Pick something that's really interesting to you. If you're going into advertising and marketing, choose something from there. If you're really interested in film, choose something from there. If you really like a book adaptation or a book, go from there. If you really want to learn how to be a sophist, look up my friend, Dr. Michelle Mazer, the Rebel speaker. Yeah, she's got something. Anyway, look her up. You'll find her all over the place. She has the same degrees I do. She studied the same things I did. She did debate as well. Her PhD is in communication, and she's out selling, I don't know, she's telling motivational speakers how to be motivational speakers. It's bizarre to me, but she lives in Seattle in a really nice apartment, and she makes a lot more money than I do, and she drives a Mini Cooper. I'm not jealous. The difference between what she does and what I do. But if you want to look at her stuff and say, all right, how do people market themselves in the digital age? She's a great example of that. You have a ton of examples of that, right? So there's a lot out there for you to do. Paper 2 should be fun, but do take it seriously because it is a scholarly work. And remember that you're arguing. Now, if I disagree with your interpretation, it does not mean you're going to fail. Okay, I have disagreed with many an interpretation in my years of teaching, and but people made really good arguments. Okay, just because they're not successful in me does not mean they're not good arguments. Okay, so do not worry about that, but have fun with it and make a good argument and convince me that your interpretation is correct. I don't like Taylor Swift. Convince me I'm wrong. The Dixie Chicks, I think, deserve a lot more credit than they get. Prove me wrong. There's a lot of things that I could say. Obama's first inaugural wasn't that great. Prove me wrong. And I actually do have a published work on that, by the way. So I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying I have a published work on it. Good in some ways, but definitely bad in others. So all these things, feel free to argue and disagree, but make sure that it's something that you care about, because that'll make it easier on you. Have fun with it. Text me if you need anything, because God knows I'm terrible with email. And also, a lot of your emails go into junk for some reason. So as somebody found out today, they just texted me and said, "Hey, I sent you an email," and I'm like, "Okay," and I went to the computer and answered it immediately. So feel free to do that. Okay, everybody, I'm going to sign off because we're at the 30-minute mark. Hopefully, this helps you with your paper.